All right, ladies and gentlemen. Today's screencast, we're going to kind of continue with the lead up to the American Revolution. So we're going to be talking about some pretty big events here. We're going to talk about the Boston Massacre, Boston Tea Party and the Tea Act, and the Intolerable Acts. Now, all of these I think you've probably learned about in the past. So it's kind of like a little bit of a review of some of these events that took place, and maybe a little bit more detail about the effects of them and how they changed the relationship between England and uh, the North American colonies at this point. So we're going to jump into it. We're going to start with the Boston Massacre. So when you look at this event in history, um, I feel like you guys have probably seen this very famous engraving before. So this engraving was done by Paul Revere, really right in the aftermath of the Boston Massacre. Now, to get the facts of the Boston Massacre, it happened on March 5th, 1770, and although they term it a massacre, only about 5 people died in this event. So there's a couple of questions that you guys should be formulating in your mind. The first thing that you should be thinking about is, well, why are British troops there in the first place? So we learned about the Quartering Act and the fact that British troops are in America to kind of, in their eyes, keep order in the colonies and to protect the colonies from outside forces like the Native Americans. But in this case, they're in the city of Boston. And a lot of the troops which you're going to see are going to be starting to be stationed in New England because New England is seen as kind of the source of this. The British look at it as an insurrection or basically just kind of a small problem within their colonies. And so you're going to see large amounts of troops are going to be stationed there. And at this point, they've been there for over a year. And the residents of Boston are kind of feeling uh, like they're being surveilled by these troops. And so there's tension that's been growing for months and months between the citizens of Boston and the troops. So on this night, a mob kind of formulates themselves, and kind of depending on who you listen to, is very different stories. So this engraving kind of shows you the patriot interpretation of what happened during the Boston Massacre. And if you could see, it's kind of like unarmed people running away from troops who are just opening fire on them. You can see their commander here in the background, who's giving them the command to shoot at these unarmed citizens. So that's the Patriots' perspective. Now, the British are going to tell a very different perspective. So one of the documents that you guys have to read to prepare for your structured academic controversy is Captain Preston's account of the Boston Massacre, and he's actually the commander of the British. And what his picture is a lot different. He says that the colonists were antagonizing the soldiers, throwing things at them, throwing snowballs, throwing rocks at them, almost like trying to bait them into shooting at them, screaming at them, to fire at them. And so he says he never gives the command for his troops to fire. So it's kind of an interesting situation here, but nonetheless, it's kind of like ratchets up the tension again between the British colonists and the British government. So the response to this is kind of interesting on a lot of fronts. So the first thing is that some patriots kind of step onto the scene. So John Adams takes a very, in a lot of ways, an unexpected role in this situation. So John Adams is a lawyer, and he decides to defend the soldiers in a trial, a famous trial that takes place. Now, you have to think, why would he do that? And it gives you some ideas about the principles that some of the founding fathers stood for. They believe in certain things. They believe in certain rights, the right to a fair trial. And uh, John Adams doesn't want these soldiers to kind of be almost lynched by an angry mob, and so he kind of takes the stand to defend them. And they're actually acquitted in the court of law. It says that they're not guilty of murder of these citizens. So it's a very interesting case that takes place. Now, as far as the British are concerned, what the British do is they kind of like pull back a little bit. They're going to pull some troops out of Boston, try and show less of the heavy hand. And after this is known as the Quiet Period, so things kind of settle down a little bit after the Boston Massacre for a while. But the economic hardships of the British are going to resurface. They need money. They need to kind of pay off their increasing debt. The acts that they're passing are not serving the purpose. And so what they're going to do is try another scheme to get more money for for their struggling economy. Um, so what happens here is they're going to pass a new act called the Tea Act. Now, the Tea Act is another interesting act. So first thing that you want to understand about factually about the Tea Act, has two purposes. One, yes, they want to raise revenue for Britain. But two, they're trying to help out a specific company. So they're trying to help out a company called the British East India Company. And this company is struggling because colonists are continually smuggling tea from other places in the world. And they're supposed to have a monopoly on the tea trade between the colonies and Britain. So it's not just that Britain has a monopoly on the trade, it's that the specific company has a monopoly on trade. And so they're trying to help them out a little bit by cramping down and putting a new tax on tea. So that's two purposes. Now, in actuality, just like the Sugar Act, this is going to lower taxes on tea. So they do a very similar thing to what they did with the Sugar Act. They lower taxes on tea and try and get more strict with their enforcement of the law. And the combination they're hoping is going to generate more revenue for both the British East India Company and their government. Now, again, the situation kind of backfires here. So what you're looking at here is a famous drawing of the Boston Tea Party. So what you know about the Boston Tea Party, some of it's probably accurate, some of it might be a little bit skewed as to your understanding. So the first thing, the organization behind the Boston Tea Party is going to be the Sons of Liberty, so that we talked about earlier. So they're behind a lot of these protest movements that take place within the British colonies. Not just in New England, but in other parts of the colonies as well. The Boston Tea Party is actually mimicked by other colonists in other parts of the colony. So actually we had a Tea Party here on Long Island. They had one in southern states. So different parts of the colonies also have their Tea Parties, but this is the most famous. Now another aspect of it that's interesting is that they dress up as Native Americans. Now, traditionally, I have the feeling you were taught they were dressed up as Native Americans to kind of disguise their identity, which is really not the case. The British know who's behind it. Um, they don't try and sneak onto it in the middle of the night unnoticed. They make noise while they're on the ship. That's why it's called the Tea Party. So it's not like a quiet affair, and they're not trying to sneak on and do it in the middle of the night. Um, some theories about why they dress up as Native Americans. Um, People kind of put forth this idea that they're trying to now identify themselves as not as British, but as something different, as an American. So we've been talking in our class a lot about the formulation of an American identity and what goes into that. So you're starting to see more and more colonists identify themselves as American. And so what they're pulling out here is they're saying almost like, not that they're Native Americans, but they're pulling that we're different than the British. We have some kind of American identity, and that's why they dress up in this fashion. Now, of course, some of you guys are probably thinking this is very ironic, and you're absolutely right. Considering the way that they treat the Native Americans, their views of the natives as kind of an other group that they don't intermingle with, that they don't want to have a coexisting society with, it is very ironic that they do this. But you have to understand their logic and why they dress themselves up like this. So the effects of this is very suffocating for the colonies. The British, in this case, what they do is they get very strict. And they pass two acts, a series of acts. So the colonists call them the intolerable acts because to them, they're completely intolerable. They can't deal with these acts. The two acts are called the Coercive Act and the Quebec Act. So it's two acts, actually. The colonists call them collectively the Intolerable Acts. Now, let's talk about the two acts, specifically what they said. So the first one, the Coercive Act, is really aimed to isolate New England, and specifically Boston, which they see as the source of this problem. So New England is kind of the source of your patriot activity that's happening here in the colonies. And they're really trying to like cut that off. So what they do is they try and almost strangle Boston and strangle New England. So they're going to ask them to, one, they have to pay for all of the tea that they've damaged. So it's an extensive amount of money. So they're going to place even more taxation on them to replace the tea that they've destroyed. The other big part of it is called the Boston Port Act. So they're going to cut off all shipments in and out of Boston. And it's a really strict punishment for several reasons. One, that's how people in New England make a lot of their money. They're merchants, trading back and forth across the Atlantic and between the different colonies. Two, just is going to kind of grind their economy to a halt, or that's what they're hoping to do with it. Now, the other thing that they do to kind of punish New England is they make this act called the Quebec Act. So if you look here on the map, this part of the newly acquired territory from the French and Indian War, they haven't decided what to do with it yet. So what they decide to do, these colonies here, these eastern colonies like Massachusetts and maybe New York and New Hampshire, they have designs on taking this territory and extending their colonies westward. So the British kind of like put a cramp on that, and what they do is they create this new territory called Quebec. Now, what really upsets the colonists about this Quebec Act is one, they lose the land, but two, they're going to allow Catholicism to be present in Quebec, and that is a religious overtone, especially for New England, who has these Puritan origins. They're not going to be so happy about having these Catholic people as their neighbors, and so it's like a double effect on the colonies. Now, they're really only focusing their punishment on one region of the colonies, the New England colonies, and they're trying to crush them. Now, I kind of like to think of it almost like, you have a parent in this case who has 13 different children. The British kind of view only one of their children as really misbehaving badly. So what they try to do is kind of take that child and make an example out of them for the rest of the colonies and really come down harsh on them to try and stop this little insurrection that they see as happening right where it is. And what you have to think about is the other 12 children in this case, the other 12 colonies, they can react in one of two ways. One, they can kind of say, wow, those are really strict punishments on Massachusetts and on Boston. I don't ever want that to happen to us. We're going to kind of get in line. Or they can kind of come to Massachusetts' aid and kind of defend them and rally around them in some way. And so this is where I feel like they really start to say, okay, things are getting serious. And the other colonies do rally behind Massachusetts. And so what's going to happen here is they're going to call a meeting very quickly. And the meeting that they call is known as the First Continental Congress. And so this is an important meeting. It's held in Philadelphia. Representatives from all the different colonies come. They kind of have to smuggle out representatives from Massachusetts, which are John Hancock and John Adams and Samuel Adams. They kind of have to like get out undercover, but they get there. So you have these different people coming from all the different colonies, and you can see George Washington there in the center. He was one of the representatives from Virginia, along with Thomas Jefferson. So a lot of your famous founding fathers are there for the first time. And so this is where they really start to talk seriously about what are we going to do about the situation? How are we going to deal with the issues with Britain? And now they're starting to contemplate, is it possible to reconcile with them? Is it not possible? So they still feel like they can reconcile with the British. They're not ready yet to break away from the British at this point. They haven't decided collectively as a group. But it is this whole idea. So this cartoon I showed you during the French and Indian War, it's going to resurface again. And it becomes a rallying cry of the Sons of Liberty and patriots in the American colonies. And so they're really going to start to say, okay, we have to work together. We have to kind of come to the defense of New England and Massachusetts and work to the best of our ability to figure out some kind of solution here at the Continental Congress. And so I think Patrick Henry's quote is a great quote, and it kind of shows you what a lot of Americans who call themselves patriots are thinking at the time. So he says, the distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American. And so right there, I think it hits kind of the nail on the head. A lot of Americans are feeling the way that Patrick Henry was feeling at the time. So I kind of want to just leave you guys with our first flag that we had as a country. It's a very cool flag, I think. So I'll